Sometime around 1863 or 64, a young man is waiting on a crowded train platform in Jersey City. As the crowd surges, he loses his footing and falls into the narrow, deadly gap just as the train begins to move. A stranger immediately reaches down and hoists him by the coat collar to safety. When the young man catches his breath and looks up to thank his savior, he realizes he is staring at the most famous actor of the era, Edwin Booth. The young man who nearly died that day was Robert Todd Lincoln, and just a short time later, the brother of the man who saved his life, John Wilkes Booth, would murder Robert's father. That bizarre encounter kicked off a lifelong proximity to tragedy. On the night of April 14, 1865, his parents invited him to join them right here, at Ford's Theater. Having spent the entire day traveling on horseback, Robert declined due to sheer exhaustion, entirely missing the assassination. Decades later, he was standing inside a Washington train station with President James A. Garfield, the exact moment an assassin shot Garfield in the back. And in 1901, Robert was just stepping off a train to visit President William McKinley when an assassin's bullet struck McKinley as well. Today, these coincidences dominate his legacy, reducing him to a piece of morbid pub trivia. But striking Robert down to a few accidents of fate erases the reality of his life. He was a highly influential architect of Gilded Age America who held vast political and corporate power. Growing up, Robert experienced profound distance from his father. Abraham Lincoln spent most of those early years practicing law on a sprawling judicial circuit. Robert later recalled that his most vivid childhood memories were simply watching his dad pack saddlebags to leave town again. By the time his father won the presidency, Robert was off studying at Harvard. The crisis of the Civil War completely consumed the White House. Robert noted that he and his father scarcely shared 10 minutes of quiet time together during the entirety of Abraham's presidency. Despite the distance, Robert felt compelled to share the immense physical risk his generation was facing. He insisted on leaving his studies to join the Union Army. This sparked fierce resistance from his mother, Mary Todd Lincoln. Having already buried 2 young sons due to illness, she was terrified of losing another. Robert persisted and eventually wore his parents down. His father asked General Ulysses S. Grant to place the young man on his staff. Robert secured a commission as a captain and an assistant adjutant, putting him squarely in the theater of war. That military persistence placed him at the absolute center of history. When the Army of Northern Virginia finally capitulated, Robert was standing right inside the parlor of the Wilmer McLean House, personally witnessing General Lee surrender. Surviving his brother's early deaths, witnessing the climax of the Civil War, and navigating the trauma of his father's murder forged an incredibly pragmatic young man. He emerged from the 1860s, determined to build a career on his own merit, refusing to coast on his family name. He moved to Chicago, completed his law studies, and passed the bar. Rather than exploiting federal connections in Washington, he started at the bottom of local politics, methodically securing an election as a town supervisor in South Chicago. Over time, his competence caught the attention of national leaders operating in the cutthroat environment of Gilded Age cabinet politics. He proved so capable that President James A. Garfield appointed him Secretary of War, a role he executed with enough skill to be retained by Garfield's successor, Chester A. Arthur. A few years later, President Benjamin Harrison elevated him to one of the most prominent diplomatic posts available, U.S. Minister to the United Kingdom, cementing his status as an internationally respected elder statesman. Throughout his public life, the Republican Party repeatedly begged him to accept nominations for vice president or even president. He flatly refused every single time. He recognized the difference between holding ceremonial glory because of his last name and wielding actual operational leverage over the nation's direction. He eventually took that operational expertise into the private sector, stepping in as general counsel for the Pullman Palace Car Company. When founder George Pullman died in 1897, Robert took over as president of the entire corporation. This was the peak of the Gilded Age railway boom. The extreme manufactured luxury of these railcars, outfitted with velvet, chandeliers, and fine woodwork, stood in stark, jarring contrast to the humble log cabin origins of his father. This chart shows the scale of the Pullman operation compared to typical regional businesses of the time. Under Robert's tenure, the company's fleet and workforce exploded, making him the chief executive of one of the largest corporate monopolies on Earth. Yet, as he managed this massive industrial machine, he carried an agonizing private burden. Following the death of his 18-year-old brother Tad, his mother's behavior became increasingly erratic. As her sole surviving son, Robert made the highly controversial public decision to have her committed to an asylum for her own safety. His adult life required a brutal balancing act. He had to navigate the intense volatility of his family's enduring legacy while ruthlessly operating a modern industrial empire. Robert's final public appearance took place on May 30, 1922, when he traveled to Washington for the official dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. Tens of thousands of people gathered around the reflecting pool. Up on the steps, the ceremony was anchored by the most powerful political figures of the era. Robert was seated directly alongside the sitting commander-in-chief, President Warren G. Harding, and former President turned Chief Justice, William Howard Taft. At nearly 79 years old, he sat on that stage as an absolute peer to the men running the country. He had earned his place there through decades of high-level cabinet service and immense corporate leadership. History has a habit of smoothing out complex lives into a few neat, tragic coincidences. But the historical record tells a different story. Robert Todd Lincoln witnessed the defining moments of the 19th century, and then he spent the next 40 years actively building the 20th.